If you have time and you're really interested in exploring this further, go to TED.com and search for Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling is a Swedish economist who really came up with these kinds of animations and thinking about how to view the city, how to view the world. But the funny thing is he talks about this, and he's Swedish. And so he says, you know, Sweden was always the healthiest country in the world, and now it's been overtaken by Singapore. He said, and why is that? He says, well, we're never going to catch up with them. It's so small, it's easy to get to the hospital. In Sweden, we've got mountains and fjords, and, but nonetheless, we're splitting hairs here when we look at the real problems in the world, when we're looking at issues of health determinants. Okay. The last thing I want to do with you is just to take a look at how different countries have developed in different ways, and then we'll pause from this. Okay? So everyone was poorer in 1960, everyone was less healthy. And over 40 years, most of the world became wealthier and healthier. Look at those big bubbles, the China and India.
Because these are straight from the cons.
It's speeding direction very, very widely. So let's look at Egypt from 1960 all the way to 2003. So from 1960 to 1986, they focused on getting healthier, wealthier rather, and then they invested in the health of their population. China, on the other hand, get healthier, get healthier, get healthier, communist, communist, get rich, starting in about 1980. Okay? This is interesting. You know, if you were to Google me, you would find that I've been a pretty big critic of the human rights regime in China over the years. But one thing is undeniable. This is the greatest and most successful experiment in reducing poverty in the history of the world. Hundreds of millions of people taken out of the most abject poverty where they are now. And one can argue, and I do, with the tactics and the techniques and the view of human rights in doing that, but you have to say, wow, they had a goal. Right? And they certainly moved towards it. Now, I want to show,
Do people talk about that in China?
if I
People even talk
can,
about that?
two countries in particular.
They're all.
Okay?
Bullying is that?
I don't know what happened to my label, but I think that's Canada. And then down over here. This is really hard to do when the labels aren't there, just so you know.
Yeah.
That's not it. Close enough. My parents moved to Canada from Tanzania in 1971. Okay? And you can see that's actually not Tanzania. I think that's Kenya, but the labels are missing. Tanzania is very similar. So you can see that in the time since when they moved here, Canada has increased its wealth by 5 or 6 times, gotten much healthier, and where they came from has hardly moved. And in fact, if it really was Tanzania, you'd see that it's regressed. So it's a question we can ask. Over a whole generation, why is it that some countries were so successful and other countries simply were not? And this really takes us to the crux of the conversation that you all need to think about as engineers who are interested in doing interventions to help people living in poverty. The economist William Easterly has written a book called The White Man's Burden. And he basically argues that international development and foreign aid do not work. He argues that the West has poured in tens of billions of dollars into foreign aid over the last generation, with results that look a lot like this. Right? So his argument is, we got to stop doing that. That's why he calls it the white man's burden. We got to stop being well-meaning white people, no offense, and let these people develop on their own, because clearly all of the interventions that we have made have not, in fact, been helpful. William Easterly's intellectual foe is an economist called Jeffrey Sachs. And it's sort of funny, because Sachs teaches at Columbia University in the north end of Manhattan, and Easterly teaches at NYU in the south end of Manhattan. And I always wonder, and it's on the same subway line, and I always wonder what would happen if they ran into one another on the subway. And would they have a good discussion? Probably not. economists, bad
I
news.
don't think they take the subway.
Yeah, Sachs definitely wouldn't take the subway. Easterly probably. So, Sachs has a very different point of view. Sachs is the architect of the Millennium Development Goals. And his argument is that, in fact, there are a whole number of very basic interventions that work. So Sachs and his team, led by a good friend of mine I went to grad school with, called John MacArthur, a Canadian, have gone around the world trying to determine interventions that work. They have a series of programs called the Millennium Villages, where they go into villages, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, and try a whole bunch of interventions to see what actually works. And Sachs's argument is, we know what works, so all we need is more money. If we can get wealthy countries to donate 0.7% of their GDP, you've probably heard of that number, then we will have enough money to stage all these interventions that will, in fact, meet the Millennium Development Goals and take people out of poverty. And Easterly says it's never worked before. What's to believe that it'll work now? And this is, in fact, probably, if I can be so bold as to say it, the single most important discussion in the world is, what do we do about global poverty? Do we just leave it, understanding that our interventions don't work? Do we try to find interventions that work? Or do we start from scratch? Or do we just not care? You know, it has always been thus. Perhaps it always will be thus. Right? And this is a very challenging situation, because it's really easy for us, living our lives of privilege in the developed world, to say, you know, I'm going to go and spend my summer in Nepal and install LED lights. And we run into a difficult question, which is, sure, those LED lights are nice and all, and it's good that these villages are getting them, but are we actually having any lasting impact in the lives of the people in Nepal whom we're trying to assist? And perhaps even more deeper and philosophical, should we be trying to have lasting impact in their lives? At what point is our desire to help end up actually becoming imperialist, or neo-colonial, or hurtful to these people in their way of life? And these are really the core questions of globalization. What do we mean by progress? What do we mean by growth? And I'm deliberately asking very difficult questions that don't have answers, because that's what professors do. We don't have to think about the real world. Mayors have to think about the real world. Professors don't. But let's pause there for a minute. What's your reflection on that? What's your own personal view? Do you think, and there's no right or wrong answers here, do you think international development works? Do you think foreign aid works? Is it something that we should be pushing more for? I know that's a hard question, and it was unfair to ask it at 6:30. We can leave those up. They were better than the animation stuff there. Okay, in fact, you've given me a visual aid, which is great. Those are nice pictures. So I'm going to pick on you now, Patrick. Okay. Do you think that the interventions that you were taking with these people when you were there were making differences to their lives?
I don't think you can give a homogeneous answer for every situation. There might have been individual improvements from the NGO as part of it in certain situations, but I think if you aggregate them all together, you get a really complex picture with no clear answer.
And by the way, I hope that these will continue to be pictures of your work in Africa and not, your last Saturday night popping up anytime soon.
There aren't any Saturday nights in EWD.
Well, they exist. You're just doing work. So what motivates you to do it then? Why do you do the work you do?
I think it's almost trying to get a better, more nuanced view of this complex thing called development, trying to understand exactly where we've been and where we can go with it. Because I think there are sort of gold nuggets out there. There is hope that the work organizations like EWB do. There's hope for that work that it can actually start to contribute to development in a positive way. Maybe not in every situation holistically, but perhaps in some situations out there. I don't think it's, to use the common phrase, there is a silver bullet out there that we can apply. I don't really agree with Jeffrey Sachs' approach. I think exploring that problem and trying to understand it and get the nuanced view of the complexities what drives me to keep at it.
What do you all think? That sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing to say. right? And one of the things I've learned in dealing with students is students always have perfectly reasonable things to say. And usually find the middle ground, which is a good thing. We could use more of that in our lives. But do you guys find that convincing? That Patrick is saying that even though it may not have had lasting improvement, even though there were some issues with the work that he was trying to do with these folks, it's good to try and good to find interventions that work. What do you think about that? I can give you a counter argument, but let me hear what you have to say if you have any thoughts on this.
I mean, I think I haven't read William Easterly's book, but I've read Jeffrey Sykes' book.
I will send Patrick a small reading list for you all, which is none of my students read the books either, so I have little tiny summaries of the arguments that you might find.
I've heard people, but one of the things I think I found convincing from Jeffrey Sykes' point of view is I think there's certain areas, like obviously even by the statistics you've shown us, obviously national policies have a huge deal to do with the people on poverty. China, India, just those two countries and their policies have a huge impact on how many people that are in abject poverty in the world. That being said, I think there are certain things that the Western countries or more developed countries can do to help engender an atmosphere that can lead to sort of those policies, whether it's helping building water systems or helping with the judiciary system, kind of creating an atmosphere where sort of the government that they can sort of help take care of these people. They can grow indigenously in their own country.
So this is a really interesting question that you're raising, which is that it's a very good learning, and I thank you for getting to it, which is when we look at those animations in those countries growing in different ways, it is very clear that government policy has a lot to do with this. And one of the questions is, to what extent do we in the West have the rights to influence government policies in other parts of the world? See what I'm saying? Can we actually say, look, the policies that you guys are following, assuming this is democratically elected government, the policies you guys are following are wrong, and you need to fix them in this way. Do we have that right? Well, and it's easy to say no, right? But when we also see that people are living in abject poverty, we could send 1 million Patricks, to fix 1 million villages, if only we were lucky enough to have 1 million Patricks, right? But if it's government policy that's causing the problem, to what extent can we impose that? I'm asking really tough questions today, aren't I? Right? Because these are really tough issues. I was gonna, Hugo Chavez. Let's talk about Chavez for a minute, right? One could argue that, and many have argued, that the anti-West, whatever that means, policies of the Venezuelan government under Chavez are the incorrect policies. But many in Venezuela would say, the poor are much better off, even if he's a pariah in the global economy. I'm neither pro nor anti-Chavez. I just think these are interesting arguments to raise, right? About our ability to impact on this stuff. Hey, how did that happen? It really does have a mind of its own back here.
I just think that to alleviate poverty, there's nothing else but a good economic growth engine. You can give as much aid as you want to another partner or another country, but if you don't stimulate their economy, they're not going to be able to get their people out of poverty. And which is the same, if we want to talk about Venezuela, that's what's been going on in Venezuela. The government has been stimulating the economy, but not doing incentives for businesses to grow up the economy, but through handing out subsidies to the people. I don't think that's a long-term policy for poverty alleviation.
How extraordinarily neoliberal of you. Have I mentioned that I hate all these terms? Neoliberal, neoconservative, neocolonial. Why do they all start with neo? Neocolonialist. But it's a really interesting argument. I'm going to come back to it.